Today, we had the great privilege of going down to our Fort Defiance here in Clarksville, Tennessee, and interviewing the curator, Mr. William Parker. During this interview, we will learn about earthen forts and why they used earth instead of brick and mortar. At the end of this interview, Mr. Parker will also give our players some advice, so the odds may forever be in their favor. We would like to extend our thanks to Mr. Parker and the entire staff here at Fort Defiance for taking the time to talk with us today. If you're a Civil War buff, come by and visit the folks here at Fort Defiance. And now, for the interview.
My name is William Parker. I'm the historical interpreter. That's just a fancy term the city gave me. It means to run the place. And I'm here at Fort Defiance in Clarksville, Tennessee. We fall under the Parks and Recreation Department. We have the fort, which is behind me here. It's an earthen fort. You'll be hearing more about that later. We also have Sevier Station up here. It is a pre-Civil War site founded about 1790. The station is still there. It's the oldest building in Montgomery County. I know East Coast, that's still new to you, but 1790 is the oldest building in the county here. And we are at the confluence of two rivers. That's what makes this site important here.
We asked Mr. Parker, why use earth over brick and mortar, and what is the significance of earthen forts in the Civil War?
We are inside the fort right now, Fort Defiance. I'll explain the name changes in just a minute. This is one of the most perfectly preserved earthen forts that I have ever seen. The earthworks that you're going to see, this is exactly what was dug out in November of 1861. The fort was dug out in about 6 days by hand. Pretty amazing when you see the scope of this fort right here. A lot of people ask me about an earthen fort. Why didn't they build a big stone structure or a wooden structure? It takes 3 to 5 years to build a proper stone fort. Well, the war would have just about been over by that time. Not only that, earthen forts are very, very effective against ordnance. One of the analogies I give, this is a big sandbag here. If you shoot a sandbag with a bullet, the bullet stops. Artillery rounds will suck right into to the earth right here. You'll be perfectly protected on the inside here. Some of the features of it. To my right, your left, that is the powder magazine. That's where the ammunition was kept. Now, originally, it would have had a timber and earthen roof over the top of it. The reason being, there's two things you want to keep out of your powder: fire and water. That would have been covered. Also here, we have both communication trenches. The short trench here was the trench that would have serviced the 42-pound gun that was over here. And these trenches were here. You could bring the ammunition from the powder magazine to the gun without being seen. You usually hear the term communication trenches with World War I. That's what brought the beans and the bullets up to the front. But that's what they were called right here during the Civil War. On the back side is a larger communication trench. That's the trench that serviced the two 24-pound field guns that were on the south wall here. If you walk straight off ahead, you walk right off into the river.
The Tennessee heat started to get to us, so we perused the museum and they got a very insightful history lesson by Mr. Parker, which we followed up by asking some questions of our own.
And the strategic importance of Clarksville. In 1861, Clarksville was a city of about 5,000 people. That was a fairly large city back in 1861. Of course, we've got the river here, the Cumberland River. We're at the confluence of two rivers, actually. The Red River comes in also, makes it important. The bluff that we're on here, that Fort Sevier / Defiance is on, it's a bluff about 200 feet above the river. Great for observation. As far as a position to put artillery to shoot down the gunboats, not really a good position. It's really up too high. You want to be right down eye level. Do you ever go to Fort Donaldson, go there and look at the river batteries there? Right eye level with the gunboat. They knocked all 4 of the gunboats out of action there. This was just too high up here. We've got a placard out here that even mentions, I don't know if this is true, but it said we were so high up there, the guns were so high, that the cannonballs actually rolled out of the end of the barrels when they were loaded. It says on a placard, so it must be true. Yeah. Probably a better spot could have been built, maybe over where Trice Landing is. I've always thought about that. The other fort here, Fort Clark, it is in a more likely area to put up a good defense. The armaments up here, though, were wholly lacking. There were only 3 cannons in the whole fort. 2 24-pounders and a 42-pounder. The 42-pounder was dismounted. So in other words, it's not working. They're not going to be able to hold out against ironclad boats with two 24-pound guns. Those are pea shooters. At Fort Donelson, they had a 128-pound gun, a 6.5 rifled gun. Those were punching holes through the gunboats. What they had here was just not going to work. That's the reason on the 19th, when Flag Officer Foote rounded the bend up there, he saw a white flag in the fort. The fort surrendered without a fight. And of course, Clarksville surrendered. Another thing about Clarksville that sometimes is forgotten, Clarksville was the #1 tobacco export city in the entire United States. We were highly prized. Our dark fire tobacco here was highly prized in Europe. France, Great Britain, they wanted the tobacco that was grown right here in Clarksville, Tennessee. It was nicknamed black patch tobacco. It was so rich that it was black in color. It wasn't. It was through the curing process that made it that color. So another benefit of having Clarksville fall, in addition to the rivers, but the tobacco too. Questions I get are obviously, what is the name of this fort? I see several different names for it. I'm going to walk you through how these names came about. This was originally called Fort Sevier, named after Valentine Sevier, who settled this hilltop here in 1790. When the fort fell, Flag Officer Foote, he wired back to General Grant. He said, "I've just captured Clarksville in Fort Defiance." There's a problem with that. That was not the name of this fort. That is the only reference, and I'm challenging anybody out there to find me another reference of it being called Fort Defiance. It's the only one I've ever seen. I'm thinking he confused it with another Fort Defiance right up here in Cairo, Illinois. There's one there too. It's at the confluence of two rivers also. And ironically, the ship he was on was the Cairo. That's just my guess. I don't know. But when the fort fell, the Union commander here, Sanders Bruce, apparently he thought a lot of himself. He named the fort after himself. So it was Fort Bruce for about 2 years. When the war ended, somebody, I guess, decided that Fort Defiance sounded more like a name for a fort that surrendered without a fight. And it was called Fort Defiance, and it's been called that ever since.
All right, sir. So can you explain the importance of the forts overall in the Western Theater?
Yes, here in the Western Theater, the rivers are going to be the keys. Those are the MSRs of today, with the rivers. That's how you move men and material. And here in Clarksville, we've got the Cumberland River here. And if you look at the state of Tennessee, there are two rivers. I'm hijacking this phrase from a professor I had at college. He said, these two rivers stick like daggers into the heart of Tennessee. You got the Tennessee River on the left, the Cumberland on the right. The Confederates want to absolutely protect these important waterways. So how do you do that? You build a series of forts to protect them. Starting right here on the Cumberland River, this fort, originally called Fort Sevier, we'll explain the name change later on. This one was called Fort Sevier. It was pretty much an unfinished fort. There were only 3 guns in the fort. However, when we moved upriver, now keep in mind, downriver. Yeah, that confuses me still. The Cumberland and the Tennessee flow backwards. That still confuses me. Yeah, so if you move downriver in Dover, Tennessee, there was another fort there. That one was called Fort Donelson. That's going to be the key, eventually, to the entire plan of the Confederates here in Middle Tennessee. There was another fort 12 miles overland on the Tennessee River. It was called Fort Henry. Because of events that happened, they thought it was going to be the key also. That did not work. It fell rather quickly. But those were the forts here. There was another fort here in Clarksville called Fort Clark, which sat across the river. In 1962, when they built the old Two Rivers Mall, they built it right on top of it, 40 feet of fill dirt. So it's gone. But those were the earthen forts right here in Clarksville and in this area.
Okay. And as far as the overall Confederate strategy for the Western Theater in its totality, what can you tell us about that?
Yes. With the Confederate strategy, pretty much in general, was it's going to have to be a quick war. They do not have the resources for a prolonged war. We see that throughout history. Nations get caught in a prolonged war that they cannot win because they don't have the resources, the men and the material. Sometimes they get caught in a two-front war that they cannot win. It seems like that happens to Germany. It's a great book, Why Germany Loses War. They get caught in two-front wars. Not only with the It's got to be a quick war. They did eventually decide to invade the north, okay? Antietam, Sharpsburg in September of 1862 turned out not to be a great idea. Of course, hindsight is 20/20, but that was going to be the plan there, a quick victory and invade the north in 62.
Okay. In the Western Theater, their main goal was to have control of the rivers.
That's correct, to protect the rivers, absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
So what about as far as railroads are concerned in the Western Theater? Did the Confederacy have a lot of importance placed on railroads in the Western Theater? Did they utilize them much?
Not much. They did. One of the problems was it was a different gauge railroad here in the South than it was up north. That's going to pose some problems. They did obviously have some railroads here. The one ran right through Clarksville here. The cities that had railroads in them and rivers, like the Clarksville's got both, that immediately made them strategically important cities. So railroads are going to play a huge role too. We'll get to the northern side a little bit. We're going to see the North construct railroads through here to supply this massive army that they were going to have here in Middle Tennessee.
Okay. And I guess in your opinion, why do you think the Western Theater collapsed unlike the Eastern Theater? Why did the Western Theater go under?
I'm glad you said it, in my opinion. Because if you ask 10 historians, you might get 10 different. Mine here, it was the Confederate leadership, the generalship. Yeah. I keep mixing in a little bit of the Eastern Theater. In the Eastern Theater, you could not ask any more from the Confederate generalship than what they did over there. What they did with the resources they had was pretty amazing on the battlefield. It just seemed like here in the Western Theater, when a bold move needed to be made, the Confederate generals didn't do it. They vacillated a lot, and when they did make a bold decision, it was just the wrong one. And I just blame it square on their shoulders. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think that the Confederate defensive strategy was more of a defense in depth type strategy, or were they planning to perhaps concentrate major groups of forces, or was that even a thought in the Confederate generalship?
Well, from the very beginning, once again, in my opinion, the Confederates were trying to hold too much with too little, trying to defend everything. Their army was just not big enough. There was a great political cartoon, and it showed Jefferson Davis laying down on a bed, and he had a blanket over it. The blanket only covered about 2/3 of his body, and on the blanket it said Confederate Army. It's what they're saying. It's just not large enough to cover everything that the Confederates wanted. They just didn't have the manpower or the resources to defend everything.
Okay. And about how many men in total do you think were in the Western Theater in the late 61? In late 61, how many men do you think?
Late 61? Oh gosh, I actually would have to look that figure up. Okay, let's just say at Fort Donelson. Okay, there were about 17,000 Confederates at Fort Donelson. Okay, Fort Henry had about probably about 2,000. Of course, most of them evacuated during the battle. Then Grant, with his army that came in, had about 27,000. So I mean, we're not really talking, hundreds of thousands of men that you see on some of these European battles. And Shallow, I believe the figures were about 50,000 Union soldiers. Confederates maybe 30, 35. I looked the figure up. But you're talking casualties there that this country never seen before. Yeah.
Right.
So after the North was able to quell the resistance in Missouri, what was their war goal from there? Were they to head south, try to link up east? Can you elaborate on what the Northern war objective would have been around November of 61?
November of 61? Well, that's when this fort here was built. And it was to capture these riverways, capture the rivers, including of course, this is going to come later in July of 63, but the Mississippi Vicksburg, to capture Vicksburg also. But Grant, who was going to be the commander of these of the Union forces here, he was probably the most innovative of the at least the generals in the Western Theater. He would think outside the box, and he had. He was always thinking one step ahead of his opponent here in the West. Once he captured Fort Henry, he controlled the entire Tennessee River there. That was a huge blow for the Southern war effort to lose the river on that one fort right there. Once Donelson fell, He controlled the Cumberland River to Clarksville. Of course, we'll get to this. This fort here, Fort Defiance, surrendered without a fight. There wasn't a battle here, okay? This was the last defense all the way to Nashville. There were no other defenses. So when this fort surrendered, Nashville was wide open for Grant to take it. And of course, that was the first Southern capital to fall.
Then after, how was he able to take Fort Henry just so quickly and everything? Was it built on bad ground? How were they able to do it without, from what I've read, much of a fight?
Yeah, it wasn't much of a fight. Several reasons. First, what you said, yes, it was built in a low area. Of course, we know who designed, who picked that spot. There were other parts on the Tennessee River, other places that were more suitable. Why they picked that location, we're not exactly sure. It was built in a low area. Matter of fact, it flooded during the battle. And Flag Officer Foote had to take a rowboat in to accept the surrender of the fort. That's not good, okay? The Confederates knew it was not tenable. They wound up removing most of the garrison. The infantry units, regiments, moved them to Fort Donelson. By the time the Union gunboats were approaching Fort Henry, there were only like 78 men. 78 men working the river batteries, the guns right there. They wound up leaving the entire fate of the entire Tennessee River on 78 men and some guns there. That was just a mistake.
And the Tennessee goes from the Ohio all the way to round about Knoxville, doesn't it? And it gets you pretty close to Huntsville, Alabama, which would have been a major southern city at that time, to be able to get some supplies and try to start a dagger into Atlanta or somewhere else that they saw fit.
Yep, and once that started, when it failed, that started what's called the River Raid, and those gunboats were unstoppable, headed up and down the Tennessee River after that. It was Muscle Shoals, I believe, was one of the areas down there to fall too. Yeah, those things, there were no guns that could knock those gunboats out. They just raided at will.
Then you spoke earlier about Vicksburg and the key to that. I know what we're hoping our players will do is try to follow that same avenue right there. But let's say something different happens. How come there was no more fighting in Missouri? Going up, trying to fight Missouri to Arkansas and come in that way. I know the fort would have been on the opposite side of the river, obviously. But why was there no more fighting that way and everything, do you think?
Okay, yeah, this is my guess here. I don't think they considered that strategically important. I'm sure somebody would absolutely argue with me that. Of course, there was the Battle of Belmont in Missouri. Grant's actually his first, whether it's won or lost, it just, okay.
Belmont, but yeah.
Yeah. There, I just don't think that they really thought that it was worth the resources. What was the other battle in Wilson's Creek?
Yes.
Okay, that was early on in the war also. But like you said, a lot of guerrilla activity out there. But as far as huge campaigning out there, after that, it wasn't. Yeah.
Do you think it's just because the riverways are just so much easier to get men, supplies, everything you need to different locations, then have a baggage train?
Yeah.
You got to protect that, do everything.
A lot of manpower too, with those trains. Yeah.
So as far as the railroads are concerned, I asked this earlier. Can you give me the importance of the seizing of Corinth
Yes.
by federal forces?
Yes. Of course, Corinth. I forget how many railroads.
I think it was like a double line.
Spider web
Yeah.
of railroads there. And it was a railroad hub. You always want to control, not only the railroads, but a railroad hub like that with the cities. Once they captured that, it was a lot more difficult for the Confederates, obviously, to supply their armies in the field with the loss of that. And Corinth was, oh gosh, I should remember that exact date, but it was fairly early in the war also, when it fell also. We see the importance, like New Johnsonville is down south of us, okay? That was built as a supply area for the Union Army that supplied the entire Western Theater. Sherman's march through Georgia. The Union Army built an entire railroad system from scratch for that fort there.
Keeping it in Tennessee is important. You just mentioned Sherman, jog my memory. Explain how vital Chattanooga is. Because Chattanooga is also on the Cumberland, correct? Or is it? Yeah, it's on the Cumberland. It's also on the Cumberland. Were there any other defenses on the Cumberland between Chattanooga and Nashville even? Or was it just, as you said earlier, this is wide open territory?
I don't think there are. I don't believe there are any defenses between there. Yeah, and then
how
of course,
vital is Chattanooga? Is it vital to a Western theater, or is it just vital as a junction between both theaters, similar to how Vicksburg is to the Southern supply line?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is my conjecture too. I would have to argue, and not only that, that was one of the areas where I mentioned lack of aggression sometimes on the Confederates' part. After Chickamauga, they had the Union Army trapped there, the Cracker Line trapped right there in Chattanooga, and wound up dropping the ball. And we won't go into Missionary Ridge and what all happened there, but that was a golden opportunity there for a Confederate victory that slipped right through their fingers at Chattanooga.
So, as you know, we're going to be attempting to refight the entire Western Theater, mainly focusing along the Mississippi River Valley in its totality. And in your opinion, you think the largest, that the entire Western Theater kind of encapsulated the goal of these forts on the rivers. They were the main goals. So what advice would you give our players that are going to be playing the Confederacy? They're going to be, we're starting in November of '61.
Right.
And they're going to be in the same situation, same amount of men, same dispositions, same forts. So what difference, what kind of advice would you give our Confederate players on how they would win the Mississippi River Valley campaign that we're about to start?
One of the first things I would do, I wouldn't invade Kentucky. That was a mistake right there. I wouldn't do that. Once again, hindsight is 20/20 here. We know that was not a good move. Now, as far as the actual plan that they had by building these series of forts, that was a pretty logical plan there. And they did have the resources at the time to win the battle. I'll have to say about Fort Donelson over here, if that battle had been fought 10 times, the Confederates should have won 9 times. They vacillated when they should have made decisive decisions. I can give you some examples of that if you want to hear.
Oh, yeah.
General Grant, after he captured Fort Henry, he was moving a division down Telegraph Road, strung out on a road, one single road. That is an enemy general's dream right there, to catch an opponent, a division, strung out an entire road by a mile. The Romans lost 3 legions in the Teutoburg Forest. I know I'm mispronouncing that, but for that exact same reason. They were strung out, they couldn't get concentrated, and the German barbarians destroyed 3 complete Roman legions. Floyd, who's the commander here, he didn't do that, didn't pay any attention. He wound up withdrawing into the fort and said, we're going to defend the fort. Ironically, Grant knew Floyd, and Grant even said, Floyd will not fight us out here. He's going to move into the fort and defend it. That's exactly what he did. That's something else, Andre. If you catch the enemy army strung out on a road, you attack them.
Right.
And you destroy them.
So overall, you probably advise our Confederate players to not be as laid back, as, be a bit more proactive compared to the
Absolutely. Not reckless, though. And there's some examples I could give you later on of recklessness. There's a big difference between being proactive and reckless. Yeah.
Okay. And could you go a little bit more in depth when you mentioned the Confederate invasion of Kentucky? What was the overarching goal, and how did that affect the Western Theater?
Well, they had Columbus, Kentucky up there, the Gibraltar of the West. I think they had 128 guns in there. Well, that both sides, Kentucky was a neutral state. Well, once they invaded, that neutrality was violated right there, and the Union Army was I guess technically allowed to move in there also. Yeah, that was not a good move. Now they've got more territory to defend.
Okay.
But then, lastly, what do you, a couple of things actually,
Sure.
lastly, is what do you think historically the Northern commanders could have done better to maybe end this fight over West a little quicker?
That is an excellent, excellent question. That, you know what, I don't know what more that they could have done, because I mean, especially here in the West, okay? They were very efficient in what they did. They were fighting a very, very determined foe. And I don't know, I can't think of what, I mean, they captured Nashville. That didn't really affect the war. Went off, what, 3 more years after that? What they did was pretty efficient in what they did, yeah. Of course, when Grant was here, yeah.
Then you mentioned determined foe. Was morale always high out west? Did it get lower after Vicksburg? How was morale generally out west?
Okay, my opinion too, once again, I think one of the reasons the morale was high in the Army of Tennessee, who we were talking about, the Confederate Army, okay, they were fighting on their home ground. Yeah, and they were fighting for their families.
Kind of like the hearth and home, where you fight a little harder.
Yeah, that's a good one, yeah.
Okay, lastly then, what advice would you give our northern players to make their campaign more successful?
That's a good question.
Because I tell you this, is that the South has all their, I made the map, I'll show you in a bit, is they have all their forts and everything. The northern players are going to start out at St. Louis and Evansville, Indiana. And the reason for Evansville, it's just my hometown, so I wanted to throw that in there. And I made the map and the rules, so I can do that.
You got that right.
But those are the places there they're going to start off with, which are still good strategically. How do you think that they could, like maybe an overland campaign in Kentucky, down to Clarksville, or would you still suggest hitting the rivers?
I'd still have to say they're going to have to deal with these forts. I would still say hit these forts, because the gunboats, they're not going to be able to move up and down the river with these forts there. They're going to have to take them. In order to defeat the Confederates on the ground even more, that would probably a whole thesis. I'd have to sit down and think about that. But what they did, like I said, here in the West, is very efficient.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, some more advice for our Confederate commanders.
Yeah, one more. There were 3 Confederate generals at Fort Donelson, Floyd, Pillow, and Buckner. Make sure that you're getting along with the other generals. And even if you're not getting along, at least cooperate with them. The generals didn't like each other. They weren't cooperating. And this went back to pre-war politics. Politics do not belong on the battlefield, okay? That just about, you could argue, doomed the Confederate plan right there from the very beginning.
Will our players take Mr. Parker's advice, or will they continue to do what they want to anyways? Find out in our upcoming Civil War campaign coming this January, Brogans and Hardtack.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have any ideas on where we should do battle next, please consider joining our Patreon and follow us on our social media linked in this video. We look forward to your dispatches.